In the mid-15th century, England was a land divided by ambition, family feuds, and the lingering scars of the 100 Years' War. It was a country where dynasties rose and fell in the shadow of castles, and where the crown was both a prize and a peril. Within this volatile realm was the House of York, a branch of the Plantagenet family, ambitious, proud, and fiercely competitive. Born into this lineage in 1449, George Plantagenet, later known as the Duke of Clarence, was the third son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His older brother would become King Edward IV, and his younger brother would be the future King Richard III. The House of York carried with it both privilege and danger, for each son was raised in the knowledge that the throne could be claimed or lost by the sword, the crown, or betrayal. George's birth was marked by the promise of ambition and shadowed by the inevitability of court intrigue. From the earliest moments of his life, he was both nurtured and warned. The crown is a treasure, but one that can drown its possessor in blood. George grew up amidst the grand halls of English nobility, a childhood filled with tutors, knights, and whispered court gossip. He was taught the arts of diplomacy, the strategies of war, and the delicate etiquette of royalty. Yet even as a boy, he observed the tensions between his father, his siblings, and rival houses. Stories of the Wars of the Roses, the bitter civil conflicts between the houses of York and Lancaster, were not distant history. They were living memory. Tales of the Battle of St. Albans, the blood feud of the Neville family, and the ever-shifting loyalties of barons painted a vivid, if frightening, backdrop for young George. The child learned quickly. Survival required charm, cunning, and the careful balance between obedience and ambition. It was a lesson he would carry into adulthood, often with deadly consequences. As George matured, his personality became clear. He was ambitious, intelligent, and not easily content with the lesser titles that his birth afforded him. He studied alliances, observed the power plays of nobles, and quietly built his own network of support within the court. His charisma won him friends among influential nobles, yet it also bred envy. He had the looks, the wit, and the lineage to be a threat, not just to other nobles, but even to his own family. Within the Yorkist household, whispers began. Could George rise above Edward, his elder brother? Could the Duke of Clarence one day claim the crown for himself? Even as a young man, George was aware of the precarious balance he walked. Loyalty demanded to his family, yet ambition stirred the heart of a would-be king. George's ambitions were further solidified by marriage. He wed Isabel Neville, daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. This union was not merely a romantic match. It was a strategic alliance that amplified George's influence. The Neville family was one of the most powerful in England, controlling vast lands, armies, and the loyalties of barons. By marrying Isabel, George connected himself to the very faction that had the power to crown or depose kings. It was a bold move, one that elevated him but also put him directly in the crosshairs of Edward IV, who feared any rival within his own family. As George's network grew and his marriage consolidated power, Edward IV became increasingly uneasy. The king had been forced to navigate civil war, rebellion, and treacherous nobles to secure his throne. Now, the man closest to him by blood, his own brother, appeared to harbor ambitions that could rival his. Tensions simmered. George was accused, or rumored, to engage in secret communications with enemies of the crown. Edward began to see Clarence not as a brother, but as a political threat. The palace, once a family home, became a battlefield of whispers, secret meetings, and veiled threats. The first seeds of betrayal were sown, and the fate of the Duke of Clarence, as a man, a brother, and a prince, would be forever entwined with the deadly dynamics of ambition and royal power. By the 1470s, Edward IV had firmly established his reign as King of England. The Wars of the Roses had left deep scars, and the crown was still fragile, its authority constantly tested by the ambitions of nobles, rival factions, and family. Within this intricate web of politics, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, maneuvered carefully, sometimes boldly, sometimes subtly. Clarence was more than a prince. He was a political player. His alliances with the Neville family, his marriage to Isabel, and his charm among influential barons made him a figure both admired and feared. Edward IV, however, watched with unease. The throne, though secure for now, remained vulnerable. A single misstep, a whispered alliance, could topple it. The court became a place of careful observation. Every conversation, every nod, every look carried meaning. Clarence's ambition was no longer hidden. It simmered beneath his courteous smile and carefully measured words. Clarence's marriage to Isabel Neville, daughter of the powerful Earl of Warwick, had placed him at the center of a network that could rival the king himself. Warwick, long called the Kingmaker, had played a decisive role in Edward IV's rise to power. His support was pivotal. Through this alliance, Clarence gained influence over lands, soldiers, and the loyalty of powerful barons. He was no longer merely the king's brother. He was a prince with resources, allies, and a claim to sway the balance of power. Edward IV began to perceive this as a threat. Every gathering, feast, and council meeting became a stage for unspoken conflict. Clarence's presence was a reminder. Even within his family, the king was not untouchable. Rumors began to circulate. It was said that Clarence was in secret correspondence with the Lancastrian faction, the enemies of Edward IV. Whether true or not, such accusations were enough to sow distrust. The king's inner circle watched carefully, whispering behind screens and tapestries. Clarence, aware of the scrutiny, continued to cultivate allies discreetly, masking ambition with courtesy, while subtly asserting his influence in court decisions. Even minor disagreements over land, titles, or military appointments became matters of suspicion. Every gesture, every nod, every word in council was dissected. The tension grew, a silent war within the court itself. Despite the outward display of family loyalty, the relationship between Edward IV and Clarence began to deteriorate. Edward, who had relied on Clarence's counsel in earlier years, now viewed him as a rival. Clarence's growing popularity among nobles and soldiers only worsened the king's fears. Every favor granted to Clarence was a potential loss of loyalty for Edward. The brothers, once close in youth, now regarded each other with caution. Family dinners, public appearances, and court ceremonies became exercises in careful diplomacy. The palace, once a place of familial unity, transformed into a theater of strategy, where every smile could mask ambition and every compliment could hide a dagger of envy. Clarence, ambitious and shrewd, did not retreat. He continued to assert his influence, lobbying for land grants, military commands, and marriages that strengthened his position. One such act, his insistence on greater control over strategic northern territories, alarmed Edward. It was a move that suggested ambition beyond the traditional role of a younger brother. Nobles whispered of rebellion, while loyalists counseled caution. Clarence's charm, intelligence, and calculated risk-taking made him popular with some and feared by others. He navigated court politics with a mixture of subtlety and audacity, knowing that one misstep could cost him everything. By now, the seeds of betrayal were firmly planted. Edward IV's advisors argued that Clarence's ambitions were dangerous, even treasonous. Every correspondence, every secret meeting, every maneuver by Clarence was scrutinized. The king, who had fought wars to secure his throne, now faced the prospect that his own brother could threaten his reign. Clarence's loyalty, once assumed, was now questioned at every turn. Suspicion hardened into inevitability. The palace walls could no longer contain both ambition and mercy. The stage was set for a tragic confrontation that would culminate in imprisonment and the infamous death that would cement Clarence's place in history. The court of Edward IV, once a place of pomp and ceremony, had become a battlefield of whispers, ambition, and suspicion. The Duke of Clarence, ambitious yet vulnerable, had navigated this treacherous environment with skill, but the very nature of his rise planted the seeds of his downfall. England, still recovering from decades of civil war, now watched as the Yorkist family's internal rivalries intensified. Clarence's story would serve as a chilling reminder that in medieval courts, loyalty was fleeting, ambition was dangerous, and even brothers could become executioners. By 1478, the tension between Edward IV and his brother George, Duke of Clarence, had reached a critical point. Clarence's ambition, once admired for its cunning, was now feared as a threat. Every alliance he had cultivated, the support of nobles, the backing of his father-in-law Warwick's legacy, and his own growing popularity, now cast him in a dangerous light. The king's advisors warned him that Clarence might attempt to seize power or conspire with enemies of the crown. Edward, a man who had fought civil war to secure his throne, could not afford such a threat, especially from within his own bloodline. The line between loyalty and treachery had blurred, leaving only suspicion and fear. On a fateful day, George was summoned under the guise of a routine council meeting. There, in the stone halls of Westminster, he was confronted by the king and his closest advisors. Accusations of treason and secret dealings with the Lancastrians were read aloud. Clarence protested, asserting his loyalty and denying all charges. But in the shadowed court, words held little power against fear and suspicion. Guards stepped forward, and the Duke of Clarence was bound in chains, a shocking sight to nobles and attendants alike. The fall of a prince, from a position of privilege to one of imprisonment, was swift and terrifying. Clarence, once a man of influence and charm, now faced the cold reality of his brother's wrath. Clarence was transported to the Tower of London, the ancient fortress that had seen kings, queens, and nobles meet their fate. The massive stone walls, echoing with centuries of intrigue and execution, became his prison. Within the tower, he was placed in a cold, shadowed cell. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of stone and fear. Guards patrolled outside, and the knowledge that his life hung in the balance made every tick of the day a torment. Here, in isolation, Clarence confronted the consequences of ambition unchecked. The very alliances that had elevated him were now powerless to protect him. The Tower, once a symbol of royal strength, had become a cage. Days turned into weeks. Clarence had time to reflect on his life, his ambitions, and the choices that had brought him here. Memories of his childhood, tutelage, and early cunning moves at court now seemed distant and almost naive. He pondered the fragile nature of power, how quickly loyalty could turn to suspicion and admiration into fear. In the cold silence of his cell, he understood that the game of ambition was dangerous, and even a royal bloodline could not guarantee survival. Outside the Tower, rumors began to circulate. Courtiers whispered that Clarence's life was in danger, that the king had decided his brother's ambition could no longer be tolerated. Some spoke in hushed tones of secret councils, of discussions with executioners, of a death both unusual and symbolic. The public, hearing fragments of these stories, watched with a mix of horror and fascination. Clarence's imprisonment became a tale in itself, a cautionary story of ambition, rivalry, and the merciless nature of royal power. Even within the Tower, the Duke of Clarence could hear the distant echoes of intrigue, reminding him that he was not merely a prisoner of stone walls, but of history itself. The trial of the Duke of Clarence was inevitable. Edward IV, advised by his counselors and fearing any delay, prepared for a decisive act. Witnesses were summoned, testimonies collected, and the charges of treason formalized. Clarence, though still dignified, understood the futility of his position. In the shadow of the Tower, surrounded by stone walls that had held countless victims, he awaited the judgment that would seal his fate. Every moment was heavy with the knowledge that ambition, family, and bloodlines could collide in tragic consequence. The trial would not merely determine Clarence's life. It would send a message to England about the absolute authority of the king and the peril of unchecked ambition. The imprisonment of the Duke of Clarence serves as a chilling reminder. In the courts of medieval England, even a prince was not immune to suspicion, rivalry, or betrayal. Ambition, once a tool for advancement, became a sword that cut closest to home. The Tower of London, cold and unyielding, stood as both sanctuary and tomb. Within its walls, Clarence's fate was sealed, not yet by execution, but by the inexorable machinery of power, politics, and family. His story would soon enter legend, immortalized in whispers, chronicles, and later, in the plays of Shakespeare, as a cautionary tale of pride, ambition, and fraternal rivalry. The Tower of London was silent, save for the distant clatter of armor and the occasional whisper of guards. Within its stone walls, the Duke of Clarence awaited the trial that would determine his fate. The accusations against him were grave. Secret dealings with enemies of the crown, plotting against the king, and acts of treason that could destabilize the fragile Yorkist rule. Clarence, once a charming and ambitious prince, now faced the full weight of the monarchy's justice. The halls that had echoed with his laughter and whispers of ambition now seemed cold and merciless. Even the faint flicker of candlelight could not warm the chill that had settled over him. On a grim morning, Clarence was summoned to a council of the king's most trusted advisers. The chamber was filled with the somber weight of history. High-ranking nobles, legal officials, and royal scribes all gathered, their expressions a mixture of duty, fear, and intrigue. Edward IV, regal yet stern, presided over the proceedings. His eyes, once filled with brotherly warmth, now held the cold resolve of a king protecting his crown. Clarence entered, chains clinking softly, every eye upon him. The prince's dignity was intact, but even he could not conceal the anxiety that gnawed at him. The accusations were read aloud with precision and gravity. Clarence had allegedly engaged in secret correspondence with the Lancastrians, conspired to undermine the king, and attempted to sway noble loyalty against the crown. Every word echoed through the stone hall, carrying the weight of political and familial betrayal. Clarence maintained his composure, refuting some claims and offering explanations for others. Yet the air was thick with inevitability. The King's Council had already decided. The execution of Clarence was not merely a punishment. It was a statement. Loyalty, even from blood, was not optional in Edward IV's England. Witnesses were called, some loyal to the king, others coerced by fear. Their testimonies painted Clarence as both ambitious and dangerous, a prince whose charm masked subversive intent. Every word strengthened the perception that he had overstepped the boundaries of royal favor. Clarence listened patiently, his mind calculating, weighing arguments, and pondering the fragility of life and loyalty. The courtroom, with its stone walls and heavy tapestries, seemed to close in upon him. Outside, London whispered of the trial, and rumors spread like wildfire, making every noble and commoner a participant in his fate. Edward IV rose. His voice, steady and commanding, pronounced the verdict. Treason was proven. The sentence, death. The chamber was silent. Even the guards, accustomed to executions and political intrigue, seemed to pause. Clarence, a prince of England, had been judged guilty. The sentence, both formal and final, echoed through the Gothic arches, sealing the fate of the ambitious Duke of Clarence. Yet even in judgment, Edward displayed restraint. He did not mock his brother. He did not gloat. In the cold calculus of power, family ties could not outweigh the needs of the throne. Clarence was returned to the Tower, his fate sealed yet his mind racing. He reflected on the fragility of ambition, the betrayals of court, and the bitter irony that his blood, shared with the king, was no shield from the crown's justice. In his final hours, he reportedly reconciled with his family as best he could, accepting the inevitability of his death. Guards prepared the cask of wine, the infamous vessel in which his life would end. Every moment carried the weight of history, as England's noble class watched, fascinated and horrified, at the unfolding tragedy. The trial and condemnation of Clarence left a lasting mark on English history. It exemplified the brutal realities of medieval politics, where ambition, loyalty, and family ties collided with deadly consequences. Shakespeare would later immortalize this episode, dramatizing the tragedy and horror of a prince betrayed by blood and ambition alike. The legend of Clarence's death, both literal and symbolic, would endure, reminding generations that the pursuit of power is never without peril. After the trial and condemnation, the Duke of Clarence was returned to his Tower cell, the weight of his fate pressing heavily upon him. Rumors had long circulated about the method of his execution, whispered in the corridors of power and echoed in the streets of London. Some said it would be public, a spectacle for the populace. Others spoke of a more secretive and terrifying fate. The legend that has endured is perhaps the most unusual in English history. Clarence would meet his end by drowning in a cask of Malmsey wine. Whether entirely true or embellished over the centuries, this story encapsulates the strange combination of cruelty and theatricality that often accompanied medieval justice. In the depths of the tower, a massive cask of Malmsey wine was brought forth. It was polished and reinforced, a dark, ominous vessel whose purpose was clear. Guards and executioners moved with silent efficiency, their faces impassive. Clarence, aware of the legend that would outlive him, maintained his composure. Though fear undoubtedly gripped him, he displayed a calm dignity. Some accounts suggest he attempted to reason, to plead, but his words fell on deaf ears. The king's sentence was absolute. Mercy had no place in this act. As the cask was readied, Clarence took a moment to reflect on his life. The childhood filled with royal instruction, the ambitions that had driven him, the alliances with nobles, and the rivalries with his brother, Edward IV. His mind traced every choice that had brought him to this point. According to legend, the Duke was led into the barrel, the liquid cold and oppressive. The lid was sealed, and the deed was carried out quietly, away from public view. The silence of the tower contrasted with the public interest outside, where rumors of this unusual death would spread like wildfire. The tale of Clarence's death became legendary, whispered in courtly halls, chronicled by historians, and later dramatized by playwrights. Shakespeare immortalized this moment in Richard III, cementing the Duke's demise in the imagination of generations. The story of a prince drowned in wine symbolized the extremes of medieval justice, both bizarre and brutal, personal yet political. Clarence's ambition, once a source of influence and charm, had become the instrument of his undoing. News of Clarence's death, whether fully accurate or enhanced by rumor, spread quickly. Nobles murmured in fear, courtiers whispered in caution, and the public absorbed the story with fascination and horror. Edward IV's actions sent a clear message. Ambition, especially within one's own family, had limits. Blood alone could not protect a prince from the consequences of perceived treachery. The execution served as both warning and spectacle, leaving a lasting imprint on England's history. The choice of a wine barrel, whether true or allegorical, carried symbolic weight. Wine, a luxury and symbol of indulgence, became the medium of death. It underscored the intersection of wealth, power, and fatal consequences. Historians and storytellers would later debate the accuracy of this method, but its legend endured precisely because it was dramatic, memorable, and deeply human. A man undone by his desires, consumed literally and figuratively by ambition. Clarence's demise echoed through the annals of history. It became a cautionary tale of family rivalry, ambition, and the ruthlessness of monarchical authority. The Yorkist dynasty continued, but the shadow of the Duke of Clarence lingered, a reminder that even the most privileged could be subject to the merciless scales of justice. In literature, art, and history, his story has remained, blending fact and legend. The mysterious method of his death captured imaginations, turning Clarence from a historical figure into a symbol. Ambition, pride, and the perilous nature of royal life. With the Duke of Clarence's death, the Yorkist court fell into a tense silence. The shock of a prince executed by royal decree reverberated through England. Nobles whispered cautiously, courtiers treaded lightly, and the king's authority, though absolute, carried an air of somber weight. Edward IV had acted decisively, ending the threat posed by his ambitious brother. Yet the manner of Clarence's demise, shrouded in secrecy, and famously carried out in a cask of Malmsey wine, sparked both fear and fascination. The court understood the message clearly. Ambition unchecked, even by blood, could be fatal. In the weeks following Clarence's death, the Yorkist court worked to stabilize its internal politics. Nobles who had previously aligned with Clarence now sought favor with the king, demonstrating loyalty and submission. Edward IV's decision reinforced the centralization of power and reminded everyone that even royal siblings were subject to the crown. Some nobles mourned Clarence in private, honoring his memory discreetly. Others were relieved to see a potential rival removed. The Duke of Clarence's alliances, once a source of political leverage, were quietly dissolved, and the balance of power shifted firmly in Edward IV's favor. Outside the castle walls, the people of London were captivated. Rumors spread rapidly. Some spoke of Clarence's audacious ambition, others of the bizarre wine-barrel death. The story became a sensation, a mixture of cautionary tale and morbid curiosity. Chroniclers recorded the events with a mix of fact and embellishment, ensuring that Clarence's life and death would not fade into obscurity. Over time, the legend of his demise merged with history, leaving a narrative that was as dramatic as it was tragic. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Clarence's life and death is literary. Shakespeare's Richard III immortalized the Duke, dramatizing his ambition, imprisonment, and unusual demise. Through the bard's work, Clarence's story transcended history, entering the realm of myth and theatrical legend. In Shakespeare's portrayal, Clarence's fate serves as both moral lesson and dramatic spectacle. His ambition, his charm, and his downfall provide a compelling narrative that continues to captivate audiences centuries later. The life of the Duke of Clarence offers profound lessons about the interplay of ambition, loyalty, and family. His rise and fall illustrate the perils of courtly intrigue in medieval England, where even royal blood could not protect against suspicion and rivalry. Clarence's story reminds us that power is fragile, that ambition can be both a source of influence and a cause of destruction, and that in a court rife with intrigue, survival often requires more than birthright. It demands prudence, foresight, and sometimes a willingness to temper desire. Following Clarence's death, Edward IV's reign stabilized further, but the shadow of family rivalry remained. His decisions strengthened the central authority of the crown, but also left a lingering reminder. The throne was never entirely secure, and ambition, even within one's own bloodline, was a dangerous game. The Yorkist dynasty, while dominant, carried the scars of fraternal conflict. Clarence's alliances, ambitions, and tragic end influenced the political strategies of nobles and monarchs alike. His story became a reference point for caution, a tale repeated in court and chronicled in history books for generations. Following Clarence's death, Edward IV's reign stabilized further, but the shadow of family rivalry remained. His decisions strengthened the central authority of the crown, but also left a lingering reminder. The throne was never entirely secure, and ambition, even within one's own bloodline, was a dangerous game. The Yorkist dynasty, while dominant, carried the scars of fraternal conflict. Clarence's alliances, ambitions, and tragic end influenced the political strategies of nobles and monarchs alike. His story became a reference point for caution, a tale repeated in court and chronicled in history books for generations.